Well, good evening. Take your Bibles and turn them to the book of Daniel, please. I have been doing a kind of an in-depth study, not necessarily on purpose. It's just the way it turned out for about the last 4 or 5 years in the book of Daniel. And I'm amazed, the more I study it, the more I find the depths to it and the more nuances, the more different things that God is accomplishing through Daniel. And I want to share a little bit of that with you tonight. There's a lot to be shared. So I've been trying to get through this study for 3 or 4 years. I tried it in Sunday school and I tried it in a Bible study, and both of those are disbanded. So I don't know if that's a sign of my teaching or what, but we're going to try it again on our Tuesday night study. So if you're interested in a more in-depth study in Daniel, you'll be welcome to join us. But one of the things that I've noticed as I've gone through Daniel in the historical section, most of us actually, when we think of Daniel, we either think of the stories or we think of the prophetic side of it, which is normal. Anytime you go through Revelation, you're going to have to refer to Daniel because it's great for prophecy. But one of the things that I think we tend to miss in looking at the history is how God has worked providentially to accomplish his will, and how he will continue to work providentially in the future through those prophetic passages. There are really only 2 ways that God works, is with miracles, where he directly intervenes in the natural world, or works of power, however you want to term it, whether he uses a person or he does it himself, or he simply sets things up in history to work a certain way to accomplish his goal. And of course, providence is mostly what he's doing in the scripture. And when you think of Daniel, we have to put this in a perspective that helps us understand not just the history of the passages and what it's dealing with and in the future. We have to see where it fits with how God is providentially working in the history of the Jews, because that's what it's all about. It's the culmination in some ways of God honoring his contract that he made with Abraham all those centuries ago. How he has provided for the people, how he's going to take care of them, how he's going to use them as a light, and on it goes. Now, if you look at the book of Daniel, you will see that it's divided just about in half. The first half of it is history, and the second half is prophetic, or dealing with prophetic things. There's a little bit of history in the prophecy section, a little bit of prophecy in the history section. But by and large, it's divided into 2 neat little groups there. So one of the things to ask yourself is, why these particular things? Daniel was in Babylon for over 70 years. So you can imagine in his life, or maybe you can't imagine, but I like to imagine that he did a whole lot more than just these 6 things, or he and his friends, because it isn't all just about Daniel. So there's a reason that God has these particular historic events in mind. And the thing to remember is these stories are true stories. When we talk about stories, sometimes it's, well, maybe they are, maybe they aren't. No, they really happen just the way they're recorded. So there is one sense where if you read it, you just simply see the history, and that's great. You see how God has worked. But if you dig a little deeper, and you have to start long before Daniel to see how he has worked things to get to the point of where Daniel is. So let's look at the first 3 verses of Daniel, or the first 4 verses of Daniel chapter 1. Very familiar. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youths in whom was no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had ability for serving in the king's court. And he ordered him to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. Now, we're familiar with this. We know that this is how we begin Daniel, with he and his friends being taken away into captivity in Babylon, and everything follows from that. But how did it get to that point? Why was it that they were ever taken away? So we have to go back. We have to get into some history, and it'll probably be boring to you, but it's necessary. Turn back to Deuteronomy chapter 28. And there are a lot of passages we could go to Because one of the things that God has done throughout the history of Israel from the time of the patriarchs on is he has warned them constantly about idolatry, about disobedience, about not living up to their end of the Mosaic covenant, of not putting him in his place in their lives. And he has told them many things that will happen. And one of the ultimate things is if you continue in this, you will have a lot of curses, you will have bad things happen to you. But ultimately, if you continue, I will carry you away into captivity and take your nation away from you. And I'll punish you for that idolatry. So here's one of those passages in Deuteronomy 28, 36 and 37. And this is in the midst of those warnings. The Lord will bring you and your king, whom you appoint over you, to a nation that neither you nor your fathers have known, and there you shall serve other gods, made of wood and stone. And you'll become an object of horror, a song of mockery, and an object of taunting among all the peoples where the Lord drives you. Now, some of that is yet to be fulfilled, the final driving away. It isn't really where we're at in Daniel, but it's leading up to this, and there's more than one of these where they're actually carried off. But this is the pattern that God has given through history. He has warned them time and time again that if they continue in their disobedience, he will have to judge them. And the reason he'll have to judge them is because he is a covenant-keeping God. We tend to generally think of his keeping the covenant, well, that means that he provides for them their land, he takes care of them in their land, and that's true. But there's another side of it. He promised them that if they disobeyed, he would punish them. So at some point, if he's going to keep covenant with the Jews and with the Abrahamic covenant even, he's going to have to punish them. He's going to have to discipline them to straighten them out. And so the reason that they're going to be carried off into any of these captivities is because God is faithful. Keep that in mind, especially when you're reading in Daniel, because it's too easy to think that somehow God was taken unawares, that somehow he really wasn't paying attention and somehow this got away from him. No, he did this to show them that he is faithful to his covenant. Now, it's kind of a negative way of looking at it from our perspective, but it's true. Now, there's a little more specific instance of this. Turn to Isaiah, because God starts being more specific about the things that he's going to do and how he's going to carry some of them out. And this impinges on our study of Daniel, particularly because of what Isaiah told to King Hezekiah. Now, again, we have to understand the context. We have to see what's going on here. This is the divided kingdom. Now, shortly before this time, the northern kingdom has been taken away by the Assyrians. The Assyrians have dominated the Mesopotamia, this whole Middle Eastern realm, for centuries. And they are the ones in control. And we see how they treat the Jews time after time. And if you read Jonah, you get an understanding of how the Jews felt about the Assyrians when he had to go to Nineveh. The Assyrians are always called cruel. And that's the one adjective you'll always find whenever you read anything about the Assyrians, is how cruel they were. And they were cruel. They were desperately cruel. And they finally had enough with the northern kingdom. And so they took the people, scattered them to the winds, brought in other foreign people, and put them in their place in the northern kingdom. That's how we end up with the Samaritans that we read about later on, especially in the New Testament. So this was the way that the Assyrians deal with people. They had dealt that way with the northern kingdom, and a few years later they thought that worked so well they would go take care of the southern kingdom as well. And that was when Hezekiah was on the throne. And at the same time as this is going on, Hezekiah is sick, is going to die. He pleads with the Lord, and the Lord gives him recovery. So at that time, we see these people from this embassy coming from Babylon in chapter 39 of Isaiah. So that's the background behind this. Sennacherib had surrounded Jerusalem. In fact, there's a very famous historical passage that talks about it in Sennacherib's own words. He says, I have Hezekiah caged like a bird in Jerusalem. So he had him surrounded. There was no getting away. Hezekiah pleads to the Lord. The Lord delivers him. 185,000 Assyrian soldiers are killed that very night. In fact, that weakening of Assyria comes into play much later with Babylon. But it's in that context that you have this. You have people coming to congratulate him on his recovery from his illness, but also it's almost certain that they want to form an alliance with this king who can destroy that many Assyrians, because the Babylonians are a part of the Assyrian kingdom, but they want to be independent again. So they come along, and it says in 39, at that time, Merodach-Baladan, son of Baladan, king of Babylon, sent letters and a present to Hezekiah, for he heard that he had been sick and had recovered. Hezekiah was pleased and showed them all his treasure house, the silver and the gold, and the spices, and the precious oil, and his whole armory, and all that was found in his treasuries. There was nothing in his house, nor in all his dominion, that Hezekiah did not show them. Then Isaiah the prophet came to King Hezekiah and said to him, "What did these men say, and from where have they come to you?" And Hezekiah said, "They have come to me from a far country, from Babylon." He said, "What have they seen in your house?" So Hezekiah answered, "They have seen all that is in my house. There's nothing among my treasuries that I have not shown them." Then Isaiah said to Hezekiah, "Hear the word of the Lord of hosts. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and all that your fathers have laid up in store to this day will be carried away to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord. And some of your sons who will issue from you, whom you will beget, will be taken away, and they will become officials in the palace of the king of Babylon." Then Hezekiah said to Isaiah, "The word of the Lord which you have spoken is good," for he thought, "For there will be peace and truth in my days." Now, there's several interesting things in this passage. Hezekiah was a real stand-up guy. As long as everything's okay with me, I don't care what happens to my progeny. But we get here a very specific prophecy that God is giving about how he is going to deal with the southern kingdom of Judah. And he says, based on what they have done here, this is one of the causes that is going to bring this about. Since Hezekiah was so foolish to show these people off, and I'm sure they appealed to his vanity. Look at all the stuff that I have, all the gold, all the silver, all the wonderful things in the temple, all of the goods that have been built up through all these years, all that his predecessors have saved up. He shows this all off. And it's kind of funny after the fact. Isaiah has to show up and ruin the show. Who are those guys? Nobody, just some guys from a long ways away from Babylon. Oh yeah, what'd you show them? Well, showed them everything. Real good, Hezekiah. Here's what's going to happen, because that's kind of a paraphrase. But it's interesting that God is already setting up providentially, though, what he's going to do. Obviously, God already knows what he's going to bring about, but he's starting to let the people of Judah know how things are going to go for them. Specifically here, King Hezekiah, that eventually this same kingdom that you have bragged to about all that you have, they're going to come back here, and they're going to take away all of those things that you showed them. Plus, they're going to take some of your future descendants, and they're going to take them away and make them eunuchs or officials in Babylon so that they have to serve the king of Babylon. And you would think that would shock Hezekiah a little bit, but when you see his callous reply, it's kind of beyond me. How could you do that? Well, that's okay. That's a long ways away. None of us ever do that, do we? Just pass it on to the next generation. But that isn't the last straw. Turn over to 2 Kings chapter 21. And we have more. Hezekiah dies eventually. His son Manasseh takes over. Now, the kings up until this time have been kind of on again, off again in the southern kingdom. They've had, I think it's 8 or 10 decent kings, some of them very godly. But they have had some that were as bad as any of the northern kingdom were. And we find here one of the rottenest of the rotten apples in Manasseh. 2 Kings 21, 10 through 12. Now the Lord spoke through his servants the prophets, saying, "Since Manasseh, king of Judah, has committed these abominations, having done more evil than all that the Amorites did who were before him, and has also misled Judah into sin with his idols, therefore this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Behold, I am bringing such a disaster on Jerusalem and Judah that whoever hears about it, both of his ears will ring. So here you have a man who was in many ways the opposite of his father Hezekiah. Manasseh, he was an ungodly idolater. He went so far as to sacrifice one of his children to Moloch. He was a total, thorough pagan. And so God uses this. It's been building up. He wasn't the only one that ever did any of those things. But he's like the ultimate pagan in the southern kingdom. And God said, he's finally had enough. It's not going to do it. He's not going to put up with this anymore. And there's a brief respite after this. So turn over a page or two to 2 Kings 23, verses 24 through 26. Because after him, his grandson, Josiah, was actually one of the more godly kings of the southern kingdom. And so we find that he has led a reformation, some call it a revival, but he has restored the worship of Yahweh. He has done a lot of good things. He was a more godly king in a lot of ways than any before him. In fact, in verse 24 there, it tells us, moreover, Josiah removed the mediums and the spiritists and the teraphim and the idols and all the abominations that were seen in the land of Judah and in Jerusalem, that he might confirm the words of the law which were written in the book that Hilkiah the priest found in the house of the Lord. Before him there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all his heart and with all his soul and with all his might, according to all the law of Moses, nor did any like him arise after him. So it seems like there's some hope here for Judah. But if you read the next verse, it tells the rest of the tale. However, the Lord did not turn from the fierceness of his great wrath with which his anger burned against Judah, because of all the provocations with which Manasseh had provoked him. It's an interesting sidelight. I like little sidelights. Manasseh, one of the worst kings that ever ruled, actually repents and returns to Yahweh, and God forgives him and restores him to the throne. But that didn't stop him from judging. So Josiah comes along, and it's more than likely during this Reformation time, this revival, whatever you want to call it, in Judah, that Daniel and his young friends maybe were born then, or at least raised by parents who were a part of that Reformation. That's an assumption, but it seems to work out well because they're such godly young men. We find out after the fact. But this is the last breath of good in the southern kingdom, Josiah. And he eventually is going to fall. We'll get to that here in a minute. But God is going to get even more specific about what he's going to do to judge. So turn to Habakkuk. Habakkuk 1, 5 through 6. I always like to pick one that you have to go through the minor prophets to figure out where you're at. If you've got an electronic Bible, it's a lot easier. But Habakkuk chapter 1, because it's all roughly in the same time period that he's dealing with all this. And it's a little bit interesting. Habakkuk is complaining about all the sin around him, and then God tells him what his solution is, and then he kind of complains that, well, you really shouldn't do it that way. So Habakkuk 1, verses 5 and 6. Look among the nations, watch, be horrified, be frightened speechless, for I am accomplishing a work in your days you would not believe it, even if you were told. For behold, I am raising up the Chaldeans, that grim and impetuous people who march throughout the earth to take possession of dwelling places that are not theirs. So now God is getting pretty specific with what he's going to accomplish here. And he lets us know this is how God works providentially. He is the one raising up Babylon. Secular history would look at it as a totally different thing than what we see it as. This is God working. He is accomplishing these things behind the scenes. He's using events in the world to bring all these things about. And if you study the history of it, it's quite interesting that the Babylonians have been abused by the Assyrians for many years, and they finally got enough mercenaries and power build up that they could rebel against them. But that was all part of God's plan, and that's what he was doing through this whole time. Now let's look in Jeremiah 25, because we're going to find out more detail as we go along. Jeremiah specifies in a couple of places, but 25 is where we'll look. exactly the length of time and how God is going to go about this. Jeremiah 25, verses 8 through 11. Now, Jeremiah is roughly a contemporary of Daniel, a little bit before and then during time. So Jeremiah is in Jerusalem when all these bad things are happening, the destruction of it, the conquest by the Babylonians, and so forth. And he is mostly ministering to the Jews who were left behind, as well as he sends messages to those in captivity. But it's a contemporary, he and Ezekiel both. So when you read these, you have to understand some of this is prior to Daniel's time, and some is contemporary with Daniel's time. But he's giving here exactly what he's accomplishing. In verse 8, chapter 25 of Jeremiah. Therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, because you have not obeyed my words, behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, declares the Lord, and I will send to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, my servant, and will bring them against this land and against its inhabitants and against all these nations round about. And I will utterly destroy them and make them a horror and a hissing and an everlasting desolation. Moreover, I will take from them the voice of joy and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, the sound of the millstones and the light of the lamp. This whole land will be a desolation and a horror, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. In verse 12, then it will be when 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, declares the Lord, for their iniquity in the land of the Chaldeans, and I will make it an everlasting desolation. So we have the full picture here of everything that's going to happen. God says he's raised up Babylon. He's going to bring them, and Nebuchadnezzar the king is going to be his servant. He's going to use Nebuchadnezzar to punish the people of Judah. And the 70 years is because they have not held true to the law of Jubilee. They've not let the land rest. They've not given it its Sabbath, among other things. So he says, I will take those years that you didn't give rest, and I will add those to you, and that's how long you're going to stay in Babylon. So 70 years. He's very specific about how he's going to do this, and he's already laid out everything that he needs. He's got the Babylonians ready. The Assyrians have been weakened. All of the history is falling into place for him to do this. Now turn over to 2 Chronicles. Chapter 35. In verses 20 through 24. Because we run across somebody we've already talked about again, back in Kings, Josiah. 2 Chronicles 35, 20 through 24. And what we have going on here is the coming war between Assyria and Egypt and Babylon. The three of them are going to be fighting. We'll talk about that more here in a minute. Verse 20. After all this, when Josiah had set the temple in order, Necho, king of Egypt, came up to make war at Carchemish on the Euphrates, and Josiah went out to engage him. But Necho sent messengers to him, saying, What have we to do with each other, O king of Judah? I am not coming against you today, but against the house with which I am at war. And God has ordered me to hurry. Stop for your own sake from interfering with God who is with me, so that he will not destroy you. However, Josiah would not turn away from him, but disguised himself in order to make war with him. Nor did he listen to the words of Necho from the mouth of God, but came to make war on the plain of Megiddo. The archers shot King Josiah, and the king said to his servants, Take me away, for I am badly wounded. So his servants took him out of the chariot and carried him in the second chariot which he had, and brought him to Jerusalem, where he died and was buried in the tombs of his fathers. All Judah and Jerusalem mourned for Josiah. So here's the ending of Josiah, the good king, the last good king. And what we have going on here, Babylon is uprising against Assyria. They're trying to throw them off completely. And there's an ongoing war. They talk about the Battle of Carchemish. It's more like the War of Carchemish. This goes on for years. And in the midst of this, Egypt decides that this is time to fulfill an alliance that they've had with Assyria and get in on some of the conquering, and they've always wanted to have Judah anyway. So they're going to go through. And for some reason, Josiah, probably to gain favor with Babylon, decides that he's going to go out and oppose Egypt to stop them from going on up into Mesopotamia to have this war to help Assyria against Babylon. And Necho the king even warns him. He has a word from the Lord. Don't come out. If you come out to oppose me, I'll kill you. Why are you doing this? You don't have any part in this. This is nothing for you. This is between me and the Babylonians. So he obviously didn't listen. He comes out and dies in battle, and with him the last hopes of any godliness in Judah fade away. But the people, just look maybe a page away, or maybe not even a page away, in chapter 36. Well, in fact, it's first 4 verses. The people act after Josiah is killed. Then the people of the land took Joaz, the son of Josiah, and made him king in the place of his father in Jerusalem. Joaz was 23 years old when he became king, and he reigned 3 months in Jerusalem. Then the king of Egypt deposed him at Jerusalem and imposed on the land a fine of 100 talents of silver and 1 talent of gold. The king of Egypt made Eliakim, his brother, king over Judah and Jerusalem, and changed his name to Jehoiakim. But Necho took Joaz, his brother, and brought him to Egypt. So here, this is during what is the Battle of Carchemish, which decided who was going to be top dog in the old world. And it was, as I mentioned before, it was Assyria joined with an alliance with Egypt against Babylon. And you would think that they'd be able to overpower them. But Assyria is not as strong as it was. Babylon's much stronger than it was. Egypt has to travel a long ways to get there, to be part of this. What ends up happening is Nebuchadnezzar, this young general, he's only about 25 years old, he beats both armies. He beats them severely. He beats them in one place. They have to move their capital. He beats them there. He destroyed Nineveh so badly that when Alexander the Great saw it centuries later, he didn't even know he was in Nineveh. It was just completely leveled and covered over, totally destroyed. So they move on, and they finally retreat to Carchemish, which was actually the capital of the old Hittite empire. So all this stuff is always happening in these same places. But he finally soundly defeated the Assyrians completely, totally defeated the Assyrians. The Egyptians take off, and they're running away to Egypt. And that's when, on their way past, they have already put Judah under tribute. Judah belongs to Egypt as far as they're concerned. So they stop and they levy this huge fine, and he doesn't like Joaz as the king, so Necho boots him off and puts his brother on, Eliakim, and they change his name to Jehoiakim, which may sound familiar because that's who we were talking about in Daniel chapter 1. So that's more or less how we get down here to this point. So you can turn back to Daniel chapter 1. God has worked all this out. He's rearranging the board, so to speak, in the Middle East so that different people are in power. He has a different plan, and he is using all this. As far as the world is concerned, this is simply one kingdom battling another kingdom, replacing them, wanting power. But from a biblical perspective, this is God putting in place the people he wants to discipline his people in the way that he wants them to be disciplined. And that's how we come down to Daniel. Let's read Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 through 6 here again so that we get the context of exactly who Daniel is. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youths in whom was no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had ability for serving in the king's court. And he ordered him to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king appointed for them a daily ration from the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank, and appointed that they should be educated 3 years, at the end of which they were to enter the king's personal service. Now among them from the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So here we see the fulfillment of the prophecy in Isaiah, and we see the end result of the war of Carchemish. Because now, at this point, Nebuchadnezzar has gone around to all the old Assyrian kingdom, and he stopped at every little town and country that they had captured, and he's telling them, you know, that payment you sent to Assyria, just send it to Babylon instead, because we are now the top dog, which they were. So that's when he gets to Jerusalem, that's pretty much what he's doing here. But while he's at Jerusalem, or right around this same time, he hears that his father's died. Now, his father, Nabopolassar, was the actual king of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar is next in line, so he has to hurry and get home and make sure that the kingdom is secured, which usually means going back and murdering all your brothers and anybody that might contest the throne. So he's in a bit of a rush. So what he does is I'm sure he levied the fine on them, told them what the amount of gold and silver and everything else that they wanted from them was going to be. And then he took some of the officials' children. He took the nobles and the royalty, the children of those. We don't know how many for sure. I've read totals of up to 80, and I don't even know where they came up with that idea, but it sounds good. But we have 4 that we look at here in particular that we're well familiar with. Now, what is going on here? He has more than one reason for taking these young men. Now, he gives an obvious one. He's going to use them as his counselors. Now, in the ancient world, and it's even true to some extent, the nobility were better and brighter. And part of that was simply true because they had more opportunities. They had a better education, they had more money, they had everything a little bit better than the common person. Plus, the attitude was simply the fact that nobility is just better than anybody else. So he takes them, and he's very specific about who he's looking for here. In verse 4, no defects, good looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and ability for serving in the king's court. Ordered them to teach them the literature and the language of Chaldeans. So he's taken people that are attractive. These are handsome young men. They're very intelligent young men. They've already been educated in Jewish wisdom and understanding. So they have some understanding and knowledge about the world already from a biblical perspective. But now they're going to be educated in the Babylonian way. And we're very familiar. In fact, I'm leaning on the fact that you're very familiar with most of these stories because we're going to fly through them pretty quick. But we know what comes next. Now, it's interesting because we see Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And it really is certain that there were others, but we never hear of any of those others. And the reason is because these are the only ones story that is worth hearing. The rest of them compromised and caved in. And we know how this went. Right away, they're going to be challenged with compromise. And look at verse 9. It's very important to see this all the way through Daniel. You have to understand. Now, God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. This is God working providentially. He has set Daniel up in such a way that he is going to become a favorite. And you can see as you go through here the way he's dealt with, that he's not your run-of-the-mill slave. Now, you have to understand these young men, they're anywhere from 12 to 18 years old. I usually put it at about 14 because I think they're actually younger than that myself. But I think 14 is a good number to go with. So you have basically high school freshmen who have been ripped from their family, have probably watched some of their family and friends be slaughtered. They're taken away from everything they've ever known, taken away from their home, taken away from their religion, taken away from the language that they know. They're brought into a foreign land, and now they're going to be molded into what the Babylonians want them to be. If it was me, I'd probably be crying myself to sleep every night at that age. But these young men are a cut above that, and that's God providentially working in their lives, already having men of such character at such a young age. So when you consider this, you have, we'll go with my number, 14-year-old boys. And here is the point of this particular passage, verse 8. But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Daniel's character is such already as a young boy that he knows what being loyal to Yahweh is. That's why it's almost certain that his parents were part of that Reformation revival during Josiah's reign. Raised by very godly parents, and you can look at their names and see that they gave them godly names. But we look beyond that. God has got them for a different reason than Nebuchadnezzar does. Nebuchadnezzar, one of the things he wants to do besides educate them, he wants to have them as a hammer to hold over the head of Jerusalem. If they decide they're not going to pay the tribute, he's got mothers in Jerusalem who are going to tell them, you will pay that tribute. They got my kid there. We can't be having any of that. Also, remember that this isn't the only place. He hasn't just gotten these from Jerusalem. Everywhere he's gone, he has collected wise men, young men just like this from all over the old Assyrian Empire, which covered the entire Middle East as we know it, Mesopotamia, all the way from Judah clear around to Babylon. He's picked up all these top-notch kids, and he's going to bring them here for hostage use, but also to train them and teach them. So it's interesting that we find out that Daniel and his friends, we understand this story. They're being trained, they're being instructed, they won't compromise, they work out a deal, which again shows God's hand in this, that they can eat just water and vegetables or that which is grown in the ground. And they thrive, we know that. And there again, I think we see the hand of God in that. But all the way through this, Daniel is doing this to keep them separate from the Babylonians. Now, I don't know how closely they're following the actual Old Testament dietary laws. I think it'd be pretty hard to follow those as strictly as they want because those were given to use in Israel, not in a foreign land. So they're going to have a hard time with all those things. But what he's done is he has set them apart that they are only going to be like this. They're not going to be like all these others. And some of those were Jews. They were happy to eat from the king's table. This was the best food you could get at that time. They had meat. Meat wasn't on the diet that often back then. So they were more than happy to jump in there. But these 4 young men resolved not to do this. And this is part of why we admire Daniel so much. He is a man of character. But one thing I think that we often disregard, we look at this as he is as a young man, but I want you to look at 2 passages in Ezekiel. Ezekiel chapter 14, verses 13 and 14, and chapter 28. As I mentioned before, Ezekiel was contemporary with Daniel. Daniel is carried away in the first captivity, it's usually called, or the first deportation in 605 BC. Then Jehoiakim thinks it's such a brilliant idea to withhold the tribute that he can get by with it and ally with Egypt, that Nebuchadnezzar has to come back and punish him. And there'll be a second deportation, I believe it's 597, and he'll bring 10,000 of craftsmen, the choicest people from Jerusalem and Judea, back to Babylon. And that's when Ezekiel comes back. So Ezekiel's in Babylon for most of Daniel's career. So Ezekiel knows him. He knows him well. And the other Jews who are captured in Babylon know Daniel well. See, the easiest way to look at Daniel's life is to compare him to Joseph, because there's parallels. When God set up how he was going to grow Israel into a nation and make them into a nation that he could use, he sent them down to Egypt so that they could do that, to be sheltered and set apart. But before that, he sent Joseph down in a horrible situation, sent him down as a slave, sent him down despised by his brother, sent him to a foreign land just like Daniel was, put him in a position where it would have been easy to compromise, but his godly character showed through so that God could use him to set the Egyptians up for the arrival of the Jews. And it gave them a place to shelter. And the same thing's going to happen in Babylon. Daniel comes and he's going to make himself so indispensable that he will be just like Joseph. He's going to provide that. And here's part of the reason we know what kind of character he has, besides the examples we see in his actual book. Ezekiel 14, 13 through 14. And here, this is God speaking through Ezekiel, and he's getting after the Jews, mostly in Babylon, but also the ones back in Judah. Son of man, if a country sins against me by being unfaithful, and I stretch out my hand against it, destroy its supply of bread, send famine against it, and eliminate it from it both human and animal life, even these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in its midst. By their own righteousness, they could only save themselves, declares the Lord God. Now, he's saying here, you people don't think that you deserve this. You do, and it is so bad with you when I judge you like I have, that if you had the most godly, righteous people you could think of interceding for you, it wouldn't do. They could only intercede for themselves. And who does he pick? Noah, Daniel, and Job. We know about Noah and Job, what kind of godly men they were and how they were used of God. Now imagine that. Here you have a contemporary of Daniel, someone who knows him personally, speaking to Jews who also know him. They know of him and what he's done in Babylon by this time. And he's putting him in the same category as those two men. He's a very, very godly man. Young man, old man. We see it through his entire life. Now look in Ezekiel chapter 28:3, talking here to the king of Tyre. But again, this is the Lord speaking, and he's talking about wisdom. He says, behold, you are wiser than Daniel. There's no secret that is a match for you. So we see from an external source, so to speak, not just from the book of Daniel, that Daniel is a righteous, godly, wise man. Very wise. So we see it from Scripture, we see it from the example, but we also see from the king's own mouth. So back to Daniel chapter 1, in verse 18. Then at the end of the days which the king had specified for presenting them, the commander of the officials presented them before Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and out of them all, not one was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's personal service. As for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers who were in all his realm. Now here's one of the key verses in Daniel, verse 21. And Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king. Now not only is it talking there about him continuing as in living that long, but he's continuing in this same way, this same brilliant, godly, righteous capacity through all of this time. One of the other interesting parallels between Daniel and Joseph, you never see specific sin mentioned about either one of them. That doesn't mean they were sinless. They weren't. They were men. But there is so much about their lives that is godly that any sin that would be brought up would be a black mark on that. And the point that God is trying to make is how godly they are. And I think that's why we don't ever see much about any of that. Now, let's move on to chapter 2 of Daniel, because now we have Daniel as established. He has shown himself to be very wise. He and his three companions, all three. So God has set this up. He's given him these abilities, given him these talents, gifts, whatever you want to call them. He's put them in a position that he wants them to be in. Now they're trained and instructed in the Babylonian ways. They have excelled in all of this above everybody else, even more than the Babylonians themselves, because they're going to be seen as better than all of those guys, not just from what he said there in chapter 1, but all the way through. So, chapter 2, how far do we go here? Well, we better get the context. Let's start in verse 1 there. Now, in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Then the king gave orders to call in the magicians, the conjurers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king, and the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to understand the dream. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. O king, live forever. Tell the dream to your servants, and we will declare the interpretation. The king replied to the Chaldeans, the command from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you'll be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be made a rubbish heap. But if you declare the dream and its interpretation, you'll receive from me gifts and a reward and great honor, and therefore declare to me the dream and its interpretation. So we have the setup again. God has chosen Nebuchadnezzar, a pagan king, to reveal coming history. And he's given Nebuchadnezzar a dream that is troubling him. It's bothering him. And it seems from the implication, the way it's worded, is that this has happened night after night. It's keeping him awake. It's not just a slight irritation. This is causing him to lose sleep. He doesn't want to sleep because he doesn't want to see this dream. So he calls in all these people he's been collecting through the years, all of his wise men he already has, brings them in, tell me the dream, and tell me its interpretation. Well, these guys, they know how their bread is buttered. Well, you tell us the dream first, and then we'll tell you its interpretation. Now, could any of us do that, right? So Nebuchadnezzar, I think he's kind of on to them. He's still a young man here, probably about 28 years old. And he says, no, we're not going to do it that way anymore. You're going to tell me the dream and the interpretation, because I know that you could make anything up. And by the way, the Babylonians, they were just like we are today. You can buy books on dreams and what they mean. They had their own interpretations. This was a cottage industry for some of them, telling what dreams meant, just like it is for a lot of people today. But the problem comes when they realize there's no way they're going to be able to guess. And he's going to know they're going to guess. Look in verses 10 and 11. These are key verses here to understand what God is accomplishing in this. 10 and 11. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, there is not a man on earth who could declare the matter for the king, inasmuch as no great king or ruler has ever asked anything like this of any magician, conjurer, or Chaldean. Moreover, the thing which the king demands is difficult, and there's no one else who could declare it to the king except God's, whose dwelling place is not with mortal flesh. So God has got them set up. He suckered them right into it. They declare, we don't know. All of us representing all of these gods, and there are hundreds and hundreds of gods represented here among these people. They realize, and they come right out and say, none of us can figure this out. This isn't even fair. I can almost picture him whining around a little bit about it. No king ever makes us do this, So, no, we're not going to play that game. You tell me, and he repeats it. Evidently, you guys misunderstood what I said before. Tell me the dream, its interpretation, or you get torn to pieces and your house is made into an ash heap. Well, what can they do? Nothing. So the king doesn't have a long fuse. And so he says, well, kill them all. Just kill them all. Kill all of these supposed wise men, all these conjurers. And we know that Daniel and his friends are in among that. This is actually, they're probably still during their probation period. They still got training wheels. They're still learning the game. So it shows, again, a lot about the character of Daniel, because if you look in chapter 2 and verse 27 and 28, when he comes in, he is going to make sure that there is nothing about this that is about him. Verse 27, Daniel answered before the king and said, as for the mystery about which the king has inquired, neither wise men, conjurers, magicians, nor diviners are able to declare it to the king. It's like, king says, can you declare this dream? Nope, nobody can do that. What? But then he goes right on. However, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will take place in the latter days. This was your dream and the visions in your mind while on your bed. I think we're all familiar with everything that took place there, and this is God laying out the future. Part of the reason he's doing this is to give the Jews hope so that they can see this is not the end. There are going to be 4 kingdoms that are going to rule, and this is what we call the times of the Gentiles. There's going to be Babylon, there's going to be Medo-Persia, there's going to be Greece, there's going to be Rome, and that will be carried on until the end times. There'll be a stone cut without hands, comes out of the mountain and smashes it all. That will be the Messiah setting up his kingdom. So it's to give Jews hope partly, but it's also to even educate the Gentiles. Remember back in verse 7, I believe it is, of chapter 2, it says, now they answered in Aramaic. Well, that portion from there on until chapter 7 is written in Aramaic. So it's almost like God is saying this is for the Gentiles to understand. So we have this all laid out. And by the way, they're all physical kingdoms. The last kingdom that's going to come is going to be a physical kingdom. It's going to be here on this earth. It's not a spiritual kingdom. It's not here now. It's not some kind of Jesus is ruling as king in your life and that's the end of it. No, it's going to come and it's going to be the fulfillment of all of God's promises to the Jews. We think of it as the millennium, and that'll carry on into eternity. But the end result of this is that in verse 46, we find out what God had in mind as far as Daniel is concerned. Because remember, he's working here. He's got a plan. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face and did homage to Daniel and gave orders to present to him an offering and fragrant incense. And the king answered Daniel and said, "Surely your God is a God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, since you have been able to reveal this mystery." Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many gifts, great gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. And Daniel made request to the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the administration of the province of Babylon while Daniel was at the king's court. Now, here's something I think too often, too many people that I've read or listened to really kind of miss what's going on here. This is a promotion. Yeah, he's made prime minister is what it would come down to in terms that we would understand. But Daniel is now the de facto king of Babylon. That's what God has been up to through this whole thing. And you're going to see this throughout here. Daniel is going to be in charge. And I think most of the glory of Babylon should be funneled back to Daniel. He's the one behind it. He's this brilliant man. He's this godly, righteous man. He's the one who understands things nobody else does. And now Nebuchadnezzar has promoted him to second in command. Well, guess what? Nebuchadnezzar is going to lean on him. In fact, I think it makes perfect sense that it's about this time, shortly after this, or actually between chapters 2 and 3, that Jehoiakim is going to revolt. Nebuchadnezzar has to go back there and carry those 10,000 people off and bring them back. And I think within a reasonable amount of time after that, we see chapter 3. So look at chapter 3, another familiar story. Let's read starting in verse 1. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits, and its width 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent word to assemble the satraps, the prefects and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces were assembled for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "To you the command is given, O peoples, nations, and men of every language, that at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire." Therefore, at that time, when all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshiped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up, except for 3 that we're very familiar with. So Nebuchadnezzar here is wanting to get the people that he's been conquering loyal to him. So he's set up a more or less a pledge of allegiance for them. He's made this image, and it seems like part of his message is, I'm not just a head of gold, I'm gold all the way down. So you don't have to worry about those other kingdoms taking over. But he set this up to represent himself and the state of Babylon. And he's just brought in 10,000 Jews who may be of the same character of Daniel, who will refuse to cave in. So he's got to make sure that he breaks some of that right away. That's part of the possible motivation. Whatever it is, it also may be because his brother had risen against him and he had to put that rebellion down sometime around this same time. But for whatever it is, he's wanting to get people to give their allegiance to him and nothing else. So the interesting thing about the polytheists, most of them have no problem with this. Polytheists, it's just one more God. So they just bow down. What's one more God? You got many of them already. But to a true practicing Jew, like Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, there's no way. They can't do it. In fact, one of the questions that's asked all the time, where was Daniel? Where was Daniel? I think probably Nebuchadnezzar sent him on a voyage to Timbuktu or something, because he knows that Daniel is not going to bow. So he's not even going to give him the opportunity to refuse. I think maybe he's got him locked in the palace. But he's not here, because you know that Daniel is not going to cave in either. He's just not mentioned here. But these young men are the same character of Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. I'm always puzzled why we call him by his Hebrew name, Daniel, but we always call them Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're Babylonian names. That's just something for you to worry about tonight. Anyway, we understand how this all comes about too. It just isn't going to happen. The key verse here would be chapter 3 and verse 15, because this is what God is going to use. Now, if you're ready, they refuse to bow down. He's going to give them a second chance, which says something about their influence on him already, that he's even going to give them a second chance. Now, if you're ready, at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, very well. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire, and what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands? Does that sound familiar? Do you remember a Pharaoh back in Exodus who said, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and besides, I will not let Israel go. Here's an echo of that with Nebuchadnezzar. Tell me, who is the God who's going to save you? I have you in my power. The mightiest men in my army are going to tie you up. You couldn't possibly get away. We're going to heat the furnace up 7 times as hot as it was. We're going to pitch you in there. Who's going to save you? Well, he's going to find out. And that's exactly what God wanted. Again, he set this up providentially. He has his men in place. He has their character, the quality of their allegiance to him in place. And he has the king about to be put in his place. So we know how it happens. They throw him in. They come out. It burns the ropes off. Not even the smell of smoke on them. They come out, and the end result of it is in verse 29. Well, let's go to 28. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's command, and yielded up their bodies so as not to serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses reduced to a rubbish heap, inasmuch as there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way. Then the king caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to prosper in the province of Babylon. He's not very creative. He likes to tear people to pieces, make their house a rubbish heap when they don't do what he wants. So he threatens that again. But it's interesting. He makes a decree of this. Now, he has just been humiliated before his entire kingdom. He's brought in every high official that there is to get them to bow down to this idol. And he's seen these 3 young Hebrews defy him and be rescued by a God greater than this image of his obviously is. And what's he going to do? Well, he kind of swallows his pride and he makes a decree. And this decree, it isn't just, you go nail it on a tree. No, this goes around to the entire kingdom of Babylon, the entire empire that he has. And this is going to be read to every person so that every person is accountable. So God is accomplishing exactly what he wants here. Now, moving on to chapter 4. We have another dream. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and this one he's more than willing to tell, but it's an interesting insight into him. Let's look at the verse 5 verses of chapter 4. Nebuchadnezzar the king, to all peoples, nations, and men of every language that live in all the earth, may your peace abound. It has seemed good to me to declare the signs and wonders which the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and flourishing in my palace. I saw a dream, and it made me fearful. And these fantasies, as I lay on my bed, and the visions in my mind, kept alarming me. Now, once again, we've got a very familiar story here. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and this one's far worse than the other one. And he knows that this isn't a good dream. And so he calls for his wise men again. People often wonder why he didn't call for Daniel. I don't think he really wants to know. what this is, because he understands it's bad. And we know it's the tree, and the watcher comes and says, chop it down, put an iron band around it, let him be mad for 7 years, and then we'll restore it. That doesn't sound good by any lights. No matter what you're trying to interpret it as, it's not good. The interesting thing about this is that Nebuchadnezzar is actually giving his testimony here. In my mind, it's clear that Nebuchadnezzar became a believer in Yahweh. And I think chapter 4 here is his testimony. He actually wrote this chapter, probably with Daniel's help. But if you look in verses 24 and 25, we see the key to the whole thing is what is going to happen to him. This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king, that you be driven away from mankind, and your dwelling place be with the beasts of the field, and you be given grass to eat like cattle, and be drenched with the dew of heaven, and 7 periods of time will pass over you, until you recognize that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind, and bestows it on whomever he wishes. That's exactly what God is wanting to accomplish through this. And again, he sent a dream. Daniel comes in. By this time, Nebuchadnezzar is almost certainly into his 60s. This is probably not long before he's going to die. And he has gotten arrogant because of, I really think, all the things that Daniel has accomplished. He's taking all that upon himself. In fact, they found in their excavations of Babylon that the bricks were stamped with, I am Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Every brick was stamped with that in certain areas. So he wasn't a humble guy. And so God is going to put him in his place, partly because he is taking glory that I think belongs to Daniel, which in turn means that it belongs to God himself. But it's interesting, some of the takes on this. There's a guy named Joshua Mark, and he's writing from an evangelical perspective. He says, surviving an apparent 7-year bout with insanity, and then in quotations, the cause of which is still not known today, Nebuchadnezzar II created a city that was not only wondrous to behold, but also a center for the arts and intellectual pursuits. Women enjoyed equal rights with men under Nebuchadnezzar's rule, though certainly not completely equal in status nor opportunity by any modern day standard. Schools and temples were plentiful, and literacy, mathematics, and craftsmanship flourished, along with a tolerance of and interest in other gods of other faiths. The great king died as he had hoped in the magnificent city he had built, an old man. So we see from secular history that it was a splendid place, but to have an evangelical say we don't know why this insanity came on him, God told us exactly why. But I think it's interesting, look at verse 37, because this has a happy ending. He's restored to his power, and the interesting thing is, for 7 years, he can't rule. He's a madman. I imagine they made him a nice little pen and fed him the best grass, but he's like an ox out here. So what's happening to the kingdom? Nothing has changed. Daniel's been running the show for years already. Nothing changed. In fact, it says when he's restored, he has even greater glory. It's because Daniel's a good manager. Anyway, verse 37. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are true, and his ways just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride. I think that's a great testimony. And I think the unspoken part is because he humbled me. That's Nebuchadnezzar's testimony. Now we have another look at how God is going to deal with the king in the next chapter, chapter 5. Nebuchadnezzar's has a happy ending. Belshazzar's doesn't have such a happy ending. And I'm just going to lay this out. You're familiar with this. He has the feast. Nebuchadnezzar had brought the vessels back, and he actually treated them with honor. He put them in the temple of Marduk and left them alone. Belshazzar's not going to do that. He's going to get the instruments used in the temple in Jerusalem. He's going to bring them in, and he's having a drunken orgy here, and they're going to drink wine out of them, make toast to the pagan gods, and so on. And God is not happy with this, obviously. He shows up, handwriting on the wall. Belshazzar is reminded of the very thing that happened to Nebuchadnezzar. You knew these things happened to Nebuchadnezzar, but you ignored them, and now you're mocking the God of heaven. And because of that, your kingdom's taken away from you. And it literally is taken away because he is killed in the midst of it. Look in verse 22, because this is kind of the key of it as to what God is doing here. Yet you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. So God is dealing here with a different king in a different way. He's going to judge him. He's going to be killed. And we know this is when the Medo-Persians, they dam the river Euphrates, come in under the wall, capture the city without firing a shot, as we'd say today. Kill the king and a few others. Basically took the kingdom over without any problem whatsoever. So now we have Daniel coming into the final kingdom that he's going to have anything to do with, the Medo-Persian kingdom, and that's in chapter 6. And of course we understand this. This is Daniel in the lion's den. The interesting thing here is usually when a kingdom conquers another kingdom, they get rid of all the top people. Well, Daniel is such quality that they see it and they keep him. Remember, God's behind all this. He set him in this position for a reason. So Persia is taken over here now. They set him up. He continues to pray even though he knows that he's going to be thrown into a lion's den. Look in verse 26 and 27 for the end of this because we're about out of time. The end result, his delivery from the lion's den. And again, we have a king making a decree. It's going to go out to everybody. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom, men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and enduring forever. And his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So here we have the career of Daniel and what God is trying to accomplish. And if you go back and look through these historical passages, what God has done is he has made sure that the polytheists understand that he is not just another God to add to their God shelf. He is a God above all. He is the living God. Darius even understands that and uses those terms. But it starts out in the court of Nebuchadnezzar. The officials begin to see it. In chapter 2, they see that Daniel is an interpreter of dreams. He is promoted. God is glorified through that. Then we have the statue set up, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. It goes back to the whole kingdom saw this. So Yahweh's knowledge and the spread of who he is every place. Decrees are put out. Then we see the final judgment of Babylon, just as God had predicted, and the fall, the taking over by the Persian Empire. And now Daniel is there to set things up for Esther, for the return of Nehemiah, Ezra, Zerubbabel. So God has been working all of this behind the scenes. Daniel has miracles, God working in powerful ways, but most of it is God simply accomplishing things as he uses people in their ordinary seeming lives. That's still the same God we serve today. So I challenge you, get into a good study of Daniel. There's far more than this to learn. Let's close in prayer. Heavenly Father, I thank you not just for the book of Daniel and how interesting it is and how encouraging it is to see how you have worked in the past, but also to realize what a godly man he was and that the reason you were able to use him was because of his godliness. Help us, Lord, to bear that in mind as we seek to be used by you. Pray you'll bless us now as we leave. In Jesus' name, amen.